Money can buy a window table above an ocean of city lights, a sommelier who hovers like a hummingbird, and a self-assurance so seamless it never once thinks to look twice at the woman refilling the water. What it cannot buy is any guarantee that she doesn't understand every syllable a person lets slip. This is the true account of a developer worth the better part of $1 billion who chose a nearly vanished language to humiliate the woman serving his table, never once suspecting it was the first language she had ever learned. On the third floor of a converted Yorkville townhouse, behind a brass door with no name on it, sat a restaurant called Solène. People who needed to ask where it was could not afford to be there. It held 2 stars, a 6-week waitlist, and a dining room where the lighting had been engineered to make jewelry look like it was lit from inside. On Friday nights, the place ran on a kind of beautiful panic. The clatter of the pass, the hiss of the salamander, the low orchestral murmur of Toronto's most powerful people deciding over $40 appetizers who would be ruined by Monday. Ren Sigurdsson had learned to move through that room the way snow moves through a forest, touching everything and disturbing nothing. She was 28, with a server's permanent half-smile and a posture that the older waiters quietly envied. What none of them knew, because she never told them, was that 3 years earlier she had been a doctoral candidate in linguistics at the University of Toronto, 2 chapters into a dissertation on language death in diaspora communities, with a fellowship and a supervisor who used words like brilliant in letters of reference. Then her mother had a stroke on a Tuesday afternoon in February, alone in the kitchen of a small house in Gimli, Manitoba, and by the time a neighbor found her, the part of Asta Sigurdsson that could speak, walk, and recognize her own daughter had thinned to almost nothing. Public care covered the hospital. It did not cover the private long-term facility with the rehabilitation wing and the staff who actually showed up, and the public wait list for anything decent ran in years, not weeks. Ren had done the arithmetic at a Tim Hortons off the Trans-Canada with a cold double-double, going colder, and the arithmetic did not care about her fellowship. She withdrew from the program, moved her mother to a place outside Toronto that cost more per month than most people's mortgages, and started carrying plates. The tips at Solène were obscene. That was the only reason she stayed. She was good at the job because she possessed the single quality, the very rich prize above all others in the people who served them. She could disappear. She knew how to arrive with a fresh bottle at the exact moment a glass ran dry, and how to dissolve back into the wallpaper before her presence intruded on a conversation about leveraged buyouts. Invisibility, she had come to understand, was not an accident of the work. It was the work. It was a little past 8 when Emery Slate, the floor manager, intercepted her by the service station with the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis. Emery was decent enough and frightened of everything, which in that room amounted to the same thing. "It's the Wexford party," he called ahead. Something tightened in Ren's stomach, but her face did not move. Everyone in the hospitality world from King Street to the lake knew Tobias Wexford. He was the heir to a real estate empire that had been swallowing the waterfront for 3 generations, and he treated waitstaff with a cruelty so practiced it looked almost like a hobby. He was the sort of man who would send back a $100 piece of fish twice just to watch the kitchen flinch, the sort who understood a large bill not as the price of dinner, but as the purchase of permission to be a monster for 2 hours. He requested the corner, Emery went on, dabbing his hairline with a folded napkin. "Whatever he wants, Ren. Please." "Whatever he wants." She nodded once and went to greet them. They came up the stairs the way weather comes in off Lake Ontario. Without asking, Wexford himself was tall and silvering and handsome in the expensive, slightly cruel way of men who have never been told no. On his arm was Genevieve Crane, an heiress in oyster-colored silk whose face had been arranged into permanent glacial boredom, and behind them came Hollis Trent and the chief financial officer of the Wexford Group, a soft, watchful man who laughed only when Tobias laughed, and always half a beat after. "Good evening, and welcome to Solène," Wren said with the warmth she had perfected. "My name is Wren, and I'll be looking after you tonight. Can I start anyone with sparkling or still?" Wexford did not look up from his phone. He lifted 2 fingers and flicked them in the air, the gesture a person uses to dismiss a dog from a clean floor. "Sparkling, cold, not drowning in ice, and send the wine man. I don't discuss wine with the help." "Of course, sir." She turned and walked, smooth as still water, back toward the service alley, where she breathed in slowly through her nose and reminded herself, the way she did most nights, that the shift would end and the check would clear and her mother would have her room. Just another table. Just another man who had confused money for character. When she returned to Poor, the 3 of them had fallen into conversation, and the conversation was not in English. It was not French, which she would have expected, nor any of the soft business languages of money. The vowels were long, and the consonants landed in the back of the throat, and the rhythm of it stopped her hand a half-inch above Genevieve Crane's glass. They were speaking Icelandic. Wren did not let the pitcher waver. She kept pouring, and she kept her face exactly where it had been, and inside her chest something old and bright turned over. Her grandmother Sigrun had come across the water in 1961, a girl of 19 from a fishing village near Akureyri, to a windswept town on the shore of Lake Winnipeg that the first Icelandic settlers had named New Iceland, Gimli, where the snow came sideways off the lake and the names on the gravestones were all son and dottir. Sigrun had married a fisherman, buried him young, and raised her grandchildren on Skyer and Saga, and a language that fewer and fewer people in the world still spoke. To Wren, Icelandic was not a curiosity in a dissertation. It was the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of a hymn sung off-key over a wood stove, the syllables her amma had pressed into her like a thumbprint, telling her over and over, "This is who you are, and no one can take it." To hear it slithering out of Tobias Wexford's mouth was like watching someone wipe their boots on a christening gown. "Look at the shoes," Wexford was saying, in fluent if oddly schooled Icelandic, not bothering to lower his voice, his eyes resting on Wren with frank contempt. "Worn through at the toe. You can practically smell the bus on her. It's a tragedy, really, that a place like this lets the help breathe so close to the food." Genevieve laughed, a thin chime of a sound. "Don't be unkind, darling," she answered in the same tongue. "She's probably saving for a knock-off handbag. Give the poor little thing her dignity. Dignity is for people who matter," Hollis put in, swirling his scotch. "These ones don't hear and don't see, they fetch. That's the whole arrangement." Wren finished pouring. Her pulse was a hammer in her ears, but her hand stayed steady as a surgeon's, and her smile, when she set the pitcher down, was warm and radiant and entirely empty. It took her perhaps 4 seconds to understand the whole shape of it. Wexford and his friends had learned their Icelandic the way they learned everything, by buying access to it. She would have wagered her week's tips that they kept a glass-walled house outside Reykjavik now, that they flew over for the geothermal spas, and the northern lights and the privilege of being seen there, and somewhere along the way they had picked up enough of the local tongue to weaponize it. A private code, a way to be vile in a crowded room, safe in the certainty that no waitress in Toronto could possibly speak a dying language from a rock in the North Atlantic. They believed their money had made them deaf-proof. "I'll have the sommelier come right over," Wren said in English, evenly. "Please let me know if there's anything at all I can bring you." She walked away with her spine straight as a fence post. She was not going to cry, and she was not going to break, and the night, she understood now, had only just begun. If Tobias Wexford wanted to play a game of secrets, she was more than content to hand him the shovel and let him dig. The dining room climbed toward its Friday fever. The silver domes lifted in unison. The soft clink of heavy cutlery, the threading between tables like figure skaters, At table 11, the air had gone toxic. Every time Wren came near, Wexford treated her approach as an invitation to perform. "Careful, Hollis," he murmured in Icelandic, watching her set down the first course, a seared scallop on a coin of celeriac. "Don't let her exhale on it. Who knows what she's carrying in from the subway? Look at the hands on her, rough as dock rope. Honestly, she looks like she hasn't slept in a week," Genevieve added, lifting her fork and inspecting the tines as though she expected to find them filthy. "They really ought to hold to a grooming standard." Wren's jaw wanted to clench, and she did not let it. She moved through the rote geometry of service, serve from the left, clear from the right, and retreated to the shadow by the cellar door with her heart burning low and steady. Her grandmother's language, the language of folk songs and bedtime stories about hidden people in the lava fields, was being dragged through the muck by 3 people whose souls had been hollowed out and replaced with appraisals. And then, somewhere between the scallop and the mains, the conversation at table 11 turned, and it turned into something far more dangerous than insults. She was leaning in to pour a burgundy that cost more than 2 weeks of her mother's care when Wexford dropped his voice and leaned toward Hollis. "The committee's handled," he said in Icelandic, taking a slow sip, nodding his approval at the wine. "Cormier, the planning fellow, 90,000 into a numbered account in the Caymans this morning. The port side permits clear next week. We start tearing down the Bellwoods Lane buildings by the end of the month." Hollis made a dry sound that might have been a laugh. "And the board? Your father? If he finds out you went around the environmental assessment by paying off a councillor, he'll have your shares before lunch." "My father is a fossil," Wexford scoffed, dabbing his mouth with the linen. "He's out in 8 months regardless. By the time anyone tests that soil properly, the towers are up, the units are sold to numbered companies in Singapore, and we're 3 shells deep. The city eats the cleanup. Some pension fund in Saskatchewan eats the rest." Wren's hand trembled exactly once, and then went still. She was no longer eavesdropping on the cruelty of a bored rich man. She was standing 18 inches from a confession, a bribery of a public official, securities fraud, an environmental cover-up, the deliberate poisoning of a balance sheet that thousands of ordinary shareholders trusted with their retirements. The Bellwoods Lane buildings on the portside parcel were affordable housing. She had read about the Tenants' Association fighting the rezoning in the Star. There were families in those buildings. There were old people who had lived there 40 years. He was laying out the entire scheme in the middle of a crowded restaurant, shielded by nothing but his arrogance and a language he had decided belonged to him. "Dune and Genevieve?" Hollis asked quietly, with a glance at the woman who was entirely absorbed in her phone. "Does she know yet about the agreement?" Wexford smiled at his fiancée with a chill that had nothing to do with affection. "She thinks she walks away with half. She hasn't read Clause 41. Her payout is tied to a holding company I'm currently running into the ground on purpose. The day she bores me, I drop her, and she leaves with the earrings and nothing else." Wren stepped back with the empty bottle. The sheer, bottomless coldness of it made her stomach turn. Tobias Wexford was betraying every single person within arm's reach. The city, his father, his investors, his friends, and the woman wearing his ring. She carried the bottle to the back and stood for a moment with her forehead nearly against the cool steel of the prep counter, nauseous and, beneath the nausea, strangely, savagely clear. But he was not finished with her. He had decided, somewhere over the burgundy, that she would be his entertainment for the evening. 10 minutes later, waiting on a side of charred leeks, Wren watched Table 11 through the porthole window of the kitchen door. Wexford had plucked a single long dark hair from the shoulder of Genevieve's silk wrap, where her extensions had shed it, and he was holding it up to the candlelight examining a flaw. She read the shape of the Icelandic on his lips. "Watch this," he said, laying the hair with surgical care across the center of his half-eaten ribeye. "I'm bored. Let's have a little fun with the help. I'm going to make an enormous scene, get the whole table comped, and have the manager fire her on the floor. It never gets old watching them beg for a minimum wage job." Genevieve giggled. Hollis lifted his glass in a small, ugly toast. The blood went out of Wren's face and left her cold all the way to the fingertips. This was no longer a matter of enduring some insults until the night ended. This man was deliberately, gleefully setting out to destroy her livelihood for the entertainment of watching her plead. And if she lost this job, this specific, well-tipping job, her mother's care stopped. The room with the rehabilitation wing stopped. The staff who actually showed up stopped. He was going to break her life the way a bored child breaks a toy, because for an evening he found it amusing. She turned and walked into Emery Slate's cramped office, where the manager was hunched over the night's covers, looking ill. She said, and her own voice surprised her with how calm it was. "We have a problem at 11. His head snapped up. "What did you do? I told you. Whatever he wants. I didn't do anything." She kept her voice level. "But in about 2 minutes, Tobias Wexford is going to call you over, claim there's a hair in his steak, demand the meal be comped, and demand that you fire me on the spot." He pulled it off, Miss Crane's wrap. "I'm telling you before it happens." Emery went grey. He stood and paced the 2 steps, his office aloud. "Are you? How could you possibly know that? Did you hear him say it?" "I heard him." Wren. He would not look at her. "If Mr. Wexford says there was a hair in his food, then there was a hair in his food. We comp it. That's procedure. We don't call a man like that a liar in his own city. And the part where he fires me. Take the rest of the week. We'll talk Monday about where things stand." "I have to protect the restaurant. Wren, you know what these people can do." "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she understood, fully and finally, the architecture of the world she had been working inside. The rules were not for men like Tobias Wexford. The rules existed to protect them, to cushion their worst impulses, and to feed people like her into the gap without a second glance. Emery was too frightened of losing his own place to spend a single coin defending hers. She was, in the most literal sense, on her own, and then underneath the fear, something rose up that was hot and clean and very bright. It was her grandmother, Sigrun, who had crossed an ocean at 19 with one trunk, buried a husband, scaled fish in the cold for 40 years, and bowed her head to absolutely no one. Wren did not need Emery Slate's permission to keep her dignity. She had never needed anyone's. "Never mind, Emery," she said quietly. "I'll take 11 myself." Before he could answer, she had picked up the side of Leeks, squared her shoulders, and pushed back out through the swinging doors into the warm gold light of the room. Just as Tobias Wexford raised his hand, drew a theatrical breath, and opened his mouth to summon the manager, and the small, delicious humiliation he had been savoring all night. He was expecting a trembling, apologetic girl. He had no idea what was walking toward him. She reached the table before a single sound left him. She stepped squarely into his line of sight and set the dish down in the center of the linen with a soft final click. She did not bow her head. She did not produce the frightened smile he was waiting for. She stood perfectly upright and let her eyes settle on his with the patient attention of someone watching a trap close. "Is there a problem with your ribeye, Mr. Wexford?" she asked in English, clearly and just loudly enough that the nearest tables paused their conversations and turned, drawn to the change in the air. His lip curled. He stabbed a manicured finger at the plate. "A problem? There is a disaster on this plate. Look at it. There is a filthy hair coiled in the middle of my steak. This is repulsive. Solène is meant to have standards, and they let creatures like you handle the food. I want the manager. I want this comped, and I want you gone. You're finished." Hollis leaned back with a smug, expectant smirk. Genevieve sighed and lifted her phone, distancing herself from the unpleasantness of the lower orders. Wren looked down at the steak. She looked at the long, dark hair. She looked, unhurried, at the brunette extensions resting against the oyster silk on Genevieve Crane's shoulder. When she spoke again, the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She did not speak in English. She did not speak in French. She spoke in Icelandic, her accent carrying the round, lilting vowels of the north, the cadence her grandmother had pressed into her over a wood stove, half a country away. "It's a lovely hair, Tobias," she said, "but we both know it's Genevieve's. I watched you pull it off her wrap and lay it on the meat 10 seconds ago with your own hand." The effect was instantaneous and total. The sneer slid clean off Wexford's face. Every drop of color drained from his skin until he was the gray of old paper. His mouth fell open. He stared at the woman in the plain black uniform while his entire understanding of the universe short-circuited and refused to restart. Hollis Devereux choked on his scotch and coughed into his napkin. Genevieve's head came up off her phone, her brows climbing toward her hairline. What did you just say?" Wexford whispered, and his voice came out thin and reedy and pleading, the voice of a much smaller man. He was trembling. The armor of 3 generations of money had been cut through by a single sentence in a language he thought he owned. Wren leaned in, resting her palms on the edge of the table. She was not finished. She was going to take his entire world apart, and she was going to do it in her grandmother's tongue. "I said you're a liar," she continued in Icelandic, her register dropping into something harder and quieter. "And I said that my shoes are worn and my hands are rough, but my soul isn't rotting in my chest the way yours is." He tried to speak and could not. His vocal cords had simply stopped taking orders. He was paralyzed by the specific animal terror of a man who has just realized he has been overheard for hours. Wren turned her gaze to Genevieve, who had gone very pale, understanding now that every cruel little joke of the evening had landed in the ears of the woman they had been mocking. But the heiress's insulted vanity was not Wren's prize. She had a far larger one in view. "He doesn't love you, Genevieve," she said softly, in flawless English now, so the surrounding tables could drink it in. Then, to make certain Wexford tasted the full agony of his own arrogance, she dropped back into Icelandic for the killing blow. "Clause 41 of your agreement. He's tied your entire settlement to a holding company in the Caymans that he is deliberately bankrupting. If he leaves you, and he plans to, you get nothing but the jewelry you're wearing. He bragged about it while I poured your wine." Genevieve gasped, both hands flying to her mouth. She rounded on him. "Tobias, what is she talking about? Is that true?" He was hyperventilating now, his eyes ricocheting around the silent room. Every table within earshot had stopped pretending not to listen. "And as for your little waterfront venture," Wren murmured, leaning until she was nearly at his ear, her voice, Anne's as cold as a January wind off Lake Winnipeg, $90,000 to Councillor Cormier. to wave through the portside permits, toxic soil, affordable housing on Bellwoods Lane coming down so you can sell, poisoned towers to numbered companies, and leave the cleanup to the city and tie. I'm sure the Ontario Securities Commission will find your offshore transfers fascinating. I imagine the RCMP will too. Hollis Devereux shot to his feet, his chair shrieking against the herringbone floor. "We're leaving," he said, his face white with the dawning horror of 3 men who had just confessed to a string of federal crimes in front of a witness with a perfect memory. "Tobias, get up. Now." But Wexford could not move. He sat staring at her as if she were something conjured up out of the lava fields to end him. "Who?" he breathed, completely undone. "Who are you?" Wren straightened and smoothed her apron. "My name is Wren Sigurdsson. My grandmother was Sigrun from Akureyri, by way of Gimli, Manitoba. She gutted fish in the cold for 40 years and never once spoke to anyone the way you spoke to me tonight." She reached behind her neck and untied the knot of her apron. "And for the record, Mr. Wexford," she let her voice carry clear and bright to every corner of the room so that not a single diner would have to ask later what had been said, "you don't need to fire me. I wouldn't carry water to a man like you if I were dying of thirst." Genevieve Crane did not wait for Tobias. She snatched up her clutch, picked up her glass of Burgundy, threw the whole of it into his lap, and walked out, her heels firing against the floor like small arms. Wren folded her apron and laid it on the table beside the contaminated steak and turned her back on the ruined man and walked the length of the dining room toward the stairs. Nobody stopped her. Emery Slate stood, frozen, slightly open. Somewhere near the bar, a single patron began, very quietly, to clap, and then thought better of it. The night outside had that particular Toronto cold that comes up off the lake in the small hours, and Wren stood on the sidewalk and let it move through her, and for one clean breath, it was the most free she had felt in 3 years. But she was not naive. Tobias Wexford was a wounded animal with limitless money, and wounded animals do not crawl off to die quietly. They thrash, and they bite, and they bury whoever is nearest. If she simply went home, he would have a team of lawyers building a case against her by Monday. Theft, defamation, instability, whatever stuck. She did not need a clean exit. She needed a shield, and she needed to strike first. She sat on a cold bench on Bloor Street with the adrenaline still singing in her blood and took out her phone. She did not call the police. A local division could be charmed or pressured by the Wexford name before the ink dried on the report. Instead, she opened a browser and searched for the Office of the Whistleblower at the Ontario Securities Commission, the one with the reward program for people who exposed exactly this kind of corporate rot. Then she searched for Priya Chandra, an investigative reporter at the Globe and Mail who had spent a decade dismantling crooked developers and had the bylines to prove it. She wrote Chandra a long, careful, surgical email. She set down everything she had heard, the name Cormier, the precise figure, 90,000, the Cayman account, the portside parcel, the Bellwoods Lane demolitions, the deliberate soil cover-up, the plan to offload liability onto the city and a pension fund. She named Hollis Devereux, Chief Financial Officer of the Wexford Group, as a witness to the confession. She noted the date, the hour, and the restaurant. She copied the substance to the Commission's secure tip portal. Then she sat with her thumb over the screen for one breath, thought of her grandmother's hands, and hit send. What followed was not a scandal. It was a demolition. Priya Chandra did not let the email sit. The sheer specificity of it, names, numbers, an offshore account, a dated confession, let her pull public planning records, cross-reference a chain of numbered companies, and put hard questions to Councillor Lyle Cormier. Cormier, a soft and frightened man who had never once imagined prison, folded inside 48 hours, and confessed to taking the wire from a Wexford shell. Within the week, RCMP officers and OSC investigators walked into the glass quarters of the Wexford group with a warrant, and Tobias Wexford was arrested in the marble lobby of his own condominium tower. In front of the neighbors, he had spent a lifetime impressing, his cuffed wrists on the front page of every paper in the country by morning. The charges were a long grey list: bribery of a public official, fraud over 5,000, conspiracy, and a sheaf of securities violations for hiding the contamination from his own shareholders. His father, the fossil, convened the board within hours and did the one thing he had always done: protected the name. Tobias was stripped of his shares, removed as president, and publicly disowned by the company to staunch the bleeding of the stock. Genevieve Crane, true to Wren's warning, retained the most ruthless family law team in the city, used the public fraud to break the agreement she'd never been allowed to read, and walked away with a settlement secured days before the federal freeze came down on his assets. Hollis Devereux, facing his own charges, did what soft men do when the floor opens and told the investigators everything and Wren, because her tip led directly to the commission, uncovering a genuine securities fraud, the halting of an illegal development, and the recovery of tens of millions in penalties and clawbacks. She qualified for the OSC Whistleblower Award. It took the better part of a year. Depositions, sworn statements, the slow grind of lawyers and the slower grind of waiting. But when the sanctions finally landed and the numbers were counted, the commission's letter arrived with a figure on it that she had to read 3 times. A little over $3 million. She paid off the balance on her mother's care in a single afternoon, the woman at the facility's billing desk blinking at the check. She moved Asta into the best private rehabilitation home in the province, the one with the music therapist and the garden, and she bought a small clapboard house with a porch on a quiet street, far from the salamander heat and the gold light and the men who confused a bill for a license to be cruel. On a still Sunday morning that autumn, she sat on that porch with a mug of coffee going pleasantly cool in her hands and watched the wind move the long grass at the edge of the yard. It was not the cold shore of Lake Winnipeg, and there were no headstones reading daughter, but it was peaceful, and it was paid for, and it was hers. She thought of Sigrun, of a girl of 19, stepping off a boat with one trunk and a language nobody around her could speak, and of all the years that woman had given her without ever once calling it a gift. Her grandmother had left her no money at all. What she had left was a handful of impossible, beautiful sounds, the inheritance of knowing exactly who she was and exactly where she had come from. And with it, when it mattered most, Wren had brought a dragon to the ground. Money could buy almost anything. It had never once been able to buy that.